long, weird passage today. Oh, it's a good one. All right, Discourse on Metaphysics 13. Since the individual notion of each person includes once and for all everything that will ever happen to him, one sees in it the a priori proofs of the truth of each event, or why one happened rather than another. But these truths, however certain, are nevertheless contingent, being based on the free will of God and of his creatures, whose choice always has its reasons, which incline without necessitating. Hi, Cheerio. All right, so we've got lots of stuff. We've got, again, some comments on the individual notion, a complete individual notion. To be a substance, to be a thing at all, is to have an idea, right? There's an idea of the thing, of the substance, which includes every truth about it. Okay, let's start reading. But before going further, we must attempt to resolve a great difficulty that can arise from the foundations we have set forth above. We have said that the notion of an individual substance includes once and for all everything that can ever happen to it, and that, by considering this notion, one can see there everything that can truly be said of it, just as we can see in the nature of a circle all the properties that can be deduced from it. But it seems that this would eliminate the difference between contingent and necessary truths, that there would be no place for human freedom, and that an absolute fatalism would rule all our actions as well as all the other events in the world. To this I reply that we must distinguish between what is certain and what is necessary. Everyone grants that future contingents are certain, since God foresees them. But we do not concede that they are necessary on that account. But, someone will say, if a conclusion can be deduced infallibly from a definition or notion, it is necessary. And it is true that we are maintaining that everything that must happen to a person is already contained virtually in this nature or notion, just as the properties of a circle are contained in its definition. Thus, the difficulty still remains. To address it firmly, I assert that connection or following is of two kinds. I'm going to make a distinction. The one, whose contrary implies a contradiction, is absolutely necessary. This deduction occurs in the eternal truths, for example, the truths of geometry. The other is necessary only ex hypothesi, and so to speak, accidentally, but it is contingent in itself, since its contrary does not imply a contradiction. And this connection is based not purely on ideas and God's simple understanding, but on his free decrees and on the sequence of the universe. Let's pause a second. Okay, so Leibniz is saying, for a thing to be a true substance, there must be a corresponding complete idea of that substance, and that idea is such that if you could perceive it clearly the way God can, right? Because where's this idea? I don't have the idea of myself, right? Not the complete idea of myself. It has to exist in the mind of God. So God could derive everything that happens in the whole world from the complete individual concept of any substance. But doesn't that mean that it's necessarily true, then, that, I don't know, my cat is sleeping on the bed over there? Isn't that necessarily true? After all, my cat is a substance, and so there's a concept in the mind of God that requires that the cat's sleeping over there. No, that's not right, though. Leibniz says it's not necessary. The distinction is this, right? A triangle has three sides. There's a contradiction in thinking that there's a triangle without three sides. Is there a contradiction in my cat over there not being asleep right now contradicts what? Sure, it contradicts the fact that's kind of sewn into the complete individual concept. But God could have created a different cat such that the world is the same, but there's no cat sleeping over there right now. There's no contradiction in general. Should God create things just as they are and the cat not be sleeping over there, that would be contradicted by the actual idea, right? The complete individual concept of the cat. But it's a contradiction ex hypothesi. It's a contradiction assuming that idea is the idea of a real being. Assuming that idea is the idea that God instantiated into the world. But God could have done things differently. God could have brought about a different world full of different substances who have their own complete individual concepts that, would describe a world that's very different from this. God could have instantiated another set of concepts instead of this set of concepts he instantiated and produce a different world. So the necessity of my cat sleeping there, there's still something there. It's determinate, right? God having created my cat can't not be sleeping over there. How does Leibniz still get freedom out of this? People have different opinions about this. Some people will say he just doesn't. Let's read on. Let us take an example. Since Julius Caesar will become perpetual dictator and master of the Republic, and will overthrow the freedom of the Romans, this action is contained in his notion. For we assume that it is the nature of such a perfect notion of a subject to contain everything, so that the predicate is included in the subject. It could be said that it is not in virtue of this notion or idea that he must perform this action, since it pertains to him only because God knows everything. But someone might insist that his nature or form corresponds to this notion, and since God has imposed this personality on him, it is henceforth necessary for him to satisfy it. I could reply by citing future contingents, since they have no reality as well, save in God's understanding and will. And because God gave them this form in advance, they must in the same way correspond to it. But I much prefer to overcome difficulties rather than to excuse them by giving some other similar difficulties. And what I am about to say will illuminate the one as well as the other. It is here, then, that we must apply the distinction concerning connections. And I say that whatever happens in conformity with these predeterminations is certain, but not necessary. And if one were to do the contrary, he would not be doing something impossible in itself, even though it would be impossible, ex hypothesi, for this to happen. For if someone were able to carry out the whole demonstration by virtue of which he could prove this connection between the subject, Caesar, and the predicate, his successful undertaking, he would in fact be showing that Caesar's future dictatorship is grounded in his notion or nature, that there's a reason why he crossed the Rubicon rather than stopped at it, and why he won rather than lost at Pharsalus, and that it was reasonable and consequently certain that this should happen. This would not show that it was necessary in itself, nor that the contrary implies a contradiction. It is reasonable and certain in almost the same way that God will always do the best, even though what is less perfect does not imply a contradiction. For it will be found that the demonstration of this predicate of Caesar is not as absolute as those of numbers or of geometry, but that it supposes the sequence of things that God has freely chosen, a sequence based on God's first free decree, always to do what is most perfect, and on God's decree with respect to human nature, following out of the first decree, that man will always do, although freely, that which appears to be the best. But every truth based on these kinds of decrees is contingent, even though it is certain, for these decrees do not change the possibility of things. And as I have already said, even though it is certain that God always chooses the best, this does not prevent something less perfect from being and remaining possible in itself. Even though it will not happen, since it is not its impossibility, but its imperfection, which causes it to be rejected. And nothing is necessary whose contrary is possible. Okay, so I got another paragraph, but first, so that God can't create round squares, and that God can't create people who clearly see the better option and choose the worse, are of different kinds here. There's no contradiction in someone seeing the better and choosing the worse. Is there? I mean, we'd have to get real careful about what choice means there. And anyway, so, but there doesn't seem to be any contradiction in that. But there's a contradiction in a round square. We will therefore be in a position to satisfy these sorts of difficulties, however great they may appear, and in fact they are not made any the less pressing by considering the other thinkers who have ever treated this matter. As long as we recognize that all contingent propositions have reasons to be one way rather than another, or else, which comes to the same thing, that they have a priori proofs of their truth which render them certain, and which show that the connection between subject and predicate of these propositions has its basis in the natures of both. But they do not have necessary demonstrations, since these reasons are based on the principle of contingency, or the principle of the existence of things, that is, based on what is or appears to be best from among several equally possible things. On the other hand, necessary truths are based on the principle of contradiction and on the possibility or impossibility of essences themselves, without regarding the free will of God or his creatures. Okay, so that's what Leibniz has to say here in 1686 about necessity and freedom. Is it satisfying? It still seems that God gets whatever God wants. God wants to create a world of these creatures, those creatures, any combination he wants, God could do it. Although God decrees that he will only do the best. Is that freedom in God? Is that freedom in humans? Big questions here. I'm not giving answers.